Hi everyone, James Reynolds here with a short lecture on other personal mobility aids. So far in this week we've been talking a lot about pedestrians and cyclists, but there's plenty of other ways that people can get around using wheelchairs, mobility scooters, prams, trolleys, all sorts of things, even electric bikes and horses. So one of the key things that we've got to think about as engineers when we're designing things is the DDA, the Disability Discrimination Act. So this is a piece of legislation that is focused on making sure that society and the road environment and so on and so forth, buildings, everything like that, are all accessible to everybody in the community, including people who have disabilities. So one of the things that you'll quite often see wandering around town and so on are these little tactile markers. The ones with the circles are the ones that tell you that there's a step or something you need to stop. And then there's also a second type which have long things in it which are sort of more for guidance. But fundamentally these tactile markers are to assist people who are vision impaired getting around the streets. And it's quite an involved process, learning your particular routes, where you need to stop, and understanding how to get about your daily life. And without these tactile markers, it can be very, very difficult for someone who's vision impaired to know where they are in relation to a road crossing, or in this case, a set of steps. And so including these in your designs, thinking about this is a very important part of designing engineering type stuff, and it's sort of a little bit questionable as to whether these are having their desired result, whether these actually will help get a vision impaired person through this bit of environment. That the DDA does require is level access for people who have reduced mobility, so wheelchairs and the sort of other mobility aids to help people get around. And one of the things we're seeing going on in Melbourne at the moment is a very, very large change to the street environment to provide level boarding for the tram network. So here's a couple of examples of platform stops that have recently been built. And this is all so that you can get passengers up to the floor level of the tram, and then they'll be able to walk across level boarding or roll across in a wheelchair without there being a step to a low floor tram. So this is part of an ongoing project which is required to be finished. I think all the street works need to be finished by 2023, and then by 2033 all of the vehicles need to be low floors. Other jurisdictions have taken different approaches to this. I was recently in Toronto, and they actually have ramps on their trams. So when the tram stops and someone in a wheelchair wants to get on, a ramp comes out of the side of the vehicle down to the street level, and it's flat enough that people can roll up the ramp and get on board that way. And of course you would be familiar with most buses. Modern buses these days both kneel, so they reduce their height to the curb height when they pull up to a stop, and then they also will have a fold-out ramp that allows someone to get on and off board in a wheelchair. There are, of course, many challenges in providing this level of access, which we're currently seeing as a problem in Melbourne. Recently there was an attempt to put level boarding tram stops up Route 96, I think it is, which failed. Didn't get planning permission from the local council due to there being not enough cycling facilities provided alongside the stop. And you can see that there was a protest held by people who still can't get on and off the tram, yeah, this is obviously a large problem for their mobility getting around town, because there's this whole public transport infrastructure that they just can't use at the moment because there's no level boarding access provided. But yes, it is a continuing work in progress, and DDA compliance these days is standard. You have to comply, but we still do have on the public transport network in particular things where we're still catching up. Other things to think about when we're sort of talking about pedestrians and cyclists and other vulnerable road users is that it's not just people walking and people on bikes who can be sort of in this space. Skateboards, scooters, segways, rollerblades, all of these ways of getting around town have slightly different characteristics and things that you should be thinking about in your design. Sadly, at the moment, there is a bit of a sort of everything's banned until we allow it sort of approach. So you can see with hoverboards, segways, and other motorised personal mobility devices in Melbourne and in Victoria are currently not allowed. They can't be used on roads or footpaths according to the law because they are defined as motor vehicles, but they don't meet the standards. Meanwhile, over in Queensland, you actually are allowed to ride some of these electric scooters on the road and on the footpath, and they come with a legal restriction. You're not allowed to go any faster than 25 k's an hour. Skateboards have always had a bit of a challenging position. Semi-legal, sometimes illegal, sometimes legal, sometimes banned. In the city of Melbourne, they have a skating plan. So they're actually considering how to incorporate skating as part of the city environment and in a controlled manner and making allowances for the needs of different users. And fundamentally, this is the same thing in electric bikes as well. We have regulations that say how much, how powerful these electric bikes are allowed to be. In Victoria, you're not allowed to have an electric bike which is more than 200 watts, and it definitely still has to have pedals for it to still be classified as a bicycle. And you know, we're having challenges at the moment with some people producing bikes that are more powerful and capable of travelling at 80 k's an hour. That's more like a motorbike, but obviously it doesn't have the same rigidity, the same vehicle design as a motorbike, and so there's a lot of shades of grey here, and it's a real challenge for regulators as to how some of these sorts of things are going to fit. And fundamentally, in this space, one of the larger concerns is safety for pedestrians. Because as soon as you have a motorised vehicle, even a mobility scooter or something like that, going at a decent speed, it can be quite dangerous, particularly for vulnerable pedestrians. So we have had a number of cases of pedestrians dying after being hit by a cyclist. If you think about it, a 100-kilogram cyclist doing somewhere in the order of 25, 30, 40 kilometres an hour, that's actually quite a lot of energy. And if you hit someone who is not particularly solidly built, you could do quite a large amount of damage to them and potentially kill them. It's obviously not as dangerous as being hit by a car, but there's significant issues if you have some of these higher speed mobility aids using the footpath in particular, and that can be quite dangerous for pedestrians. On a more positive note, there is the occasional time that you have to do a bit of designing and thinking about other users, and I've always loved these, the Pegasus crossing. It's a specifically designed crossing for horse riders, and you can see here we are somewhere in the middle of London, and they've put the nice little button way up the top there so that when you're on your horse you can press the button and the Pegasus crossing will turn green when it's your turn to cross. So yeah, these are some of the other things to think about when you're designing facilities for pedestrians, cyclists, and the occasional other type of user.